Today I'm speaking with Matt Ware. Now, Matt's the senior pastor for Victory Church in the Denver area. Matt and I are going to be talking about pivoting. And during the past year, every church in the country has had to pivot because of COVID-19. So now the question becomes, what are the next pivot steps you need to take? Because going back is not an option. Well, Matt gives some really good insight into how they made a very successful pivot. I hope you enjoy. Well, hey, Matt, thanks so much for joining us. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, glad to be with you, Jason. Appreciate the opportunity. And man, just love what you guys do. Love being able to partner with you in all of this. So glad to sit down and chat for a few minutes today.
Absolutely. So tell me what it's been like for you to lead through this last season of ministry with COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think obviously people have very different perspectives on this, kind of depending on their context and their wiring and all of that. And so I actually feel like this has been the best, most exhilarating, most exciting leadership opportunity for me that I've ever had. And I've absolutely loved it. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't some hard days and some stressful situations as we've all been through over the last number of months. But I think from a leadership perspective, my view on this is really leaders are made for these types of situations. Their leaders are made in crisis. They're made for crisis, I think, and crisis calls leadership out of us, I think, in a greater way. So I've honestly loved it. And that's not to say that, there's not real issues that you're dealing with people in the church and in ministry and the challenges that they're walking through. But from a pastoral position, from a leadership position, I just think, man, there's never been a better time or a better opportunity to jump in and just lead people toward the best things that God has for them.
So I'm sure, there's like two camps. Leading your staff, probably a lot easier than maybe leading the congregation. What's it been like for both?
Yeah, I think, in our context, and of course, everybody's context is different. So,
Right.
Just to give you maybe a little bit of perspective for us, we had not been live streaming our services prior to COVID. Of course, we did what a lot of churches, that we're doing. We'd put the video on the website 24 hours later, on a Monday or Tuesday or whatever, but we weren't actually live streaming. And so, of course, like everyone, we pivoted very quickly.
Yeah.
What was interesting for us is we had already actually launched a resource initiative about a year ago to raise funds because part of our vision was to be live streaming. And so we had already raised some funding for that. And so we were able to quickly pivot to that in terms of having the resources to get some of the gear and the setup and all those things. So we were in a very unique position in that way because not only was it out of necessity, but it actually just gave us a catapult forward into some things that we had already planned from a vision standpoint. And so for our congregation, that was a huge win because all of a sudden the world's falling apart, but our church is doing something and moving forward, and we had already given to it. And so that was a win for the church. But of course, the challenge of leadership for everybody, even if they were live streaming, is how do you now engage people in an exclusively online environment?
Right.
And so, just like everybody, we're learning how to do that and figuring that out. And really, I think trying to make the shift between the shift from attendance to engagement. I think pastors are so dialed into this idea of, how many people are coming. And we know it's not just the number, but we know that those numbers represent people and lives and stories. And so now, we don't see the people in front of us necessarily, even if you're reopened, you don't see the crowds maybe like you used to,
Right.
But how can you gauge engagement? And that's really something that we're focusing on, both in an online, and now we have just begun to have services in person again. So engagement, I think, has been the big challenge from a congregational leadership perspective.
Have you, so looking at 2021, which let's get through this year and over with it quickly.
Right. Yeah. Are we thinking about 2021 already? Come on.
But so, when you think about the church, I heard a quote one time, and I forget the source of it, but that said, we want to be seen as an online church with physical locations. It's a different mindset, right? And when you think about the future and how you create that engagement, not just with your own congregation, but from people in your community. Is that something you guys are thinking about and planning about, and then you've had to execute on it.
Right.
But what does that look like for you, for your church in the future?
Yeah, I think that's really a great question that the whole Big C church probably is wrestling with right now. It's been interesting because when we first shifted to an online environment, the company line, not just for us, but I think for everybody, is, hey, the church is not a building, the church is people. So even though we can't be in the building, we can still be the church, and all of that's true, and that's right. But what we also discovered in the process is that there is really a value in the gathering of the family of Christ. And so how do we bridge both and say, we really can see online engagement as legitimate engagement in the church, while also recognizing there are some things that just don't translate outside of human interaction. And of course, we live in a world that's different, in so many ways. And so it's interesting because one of the, and I would love to quote them on it, but I don't remember who it was. They were talking about this idea early on. This is maybe like in May of this year, and they talked about the idea that it doesn't matter how you meet the person that you're dating. You might have met them, in a church service. You might have met them, in a club. You might have met them online. However you met them, and especially talking about this digital environment, the goal is not to have an online relationship. The goal ultimately is to, even if you met them through online dating, you actually want to sit down in a restaurant and have dinner together at some point. And so we are thinking about this idea that online is great and there's so much ministry that we can do, but ultimately we still believe there's such a value in people having interaction with each other. And so how do you meet them where they are? Which is online right now in a lot of cases, and I think will increasingly be. And we've all known that online is the front door for the church for a long time anyway. But then how do we actually sit down at the table with them, so to speak? And so I think that we've had some interesting experiences with that already. I'm sure, like some other churches, where people are engaging online and they're actually joining our small groups, and we've had people start giving to the church even though they've never physically been to the church. And so we know there's a ton of potential there, and yet we'd love to have real face-to-face, contact with them too.
Yeah, well, that's what I get really excited, because I think this pandemic has caused leaders like yourself to have to think about what online looks like. How can you engage somebody, disciple somebody from a distance, but ultimately understanding you really want to have face-to-face communication when you can, connections when you can. But for you to even start with building ways and methods and content to connect with people online, I think there's a ton of value in that, because the church wasn't doing that. It was all, no, just come to our church and then we'll connect. And that's changed.
Absolutely. And I think that's where everybody's got to get creative, probably in their own context, because what we've discovered is, what is working in some other church doesn't necessarily work for us, and probably some things we're doing wouldn't work in other places too. Right. So I think there is still this value of saying, as a spiritual leader, as a shepherd, as it were, to this flock, do you know your flock? Do you know the people who God's already brought into your community? And how do you meet them where they're at? And we, to be honest with you, we've tried some things that worked and tried some things that didn't work. And man, what a great year to experiment with things. And if it works, you say, man, God's really with us. And if it doesn't work, you blame it on COVID, and it's great. So.
Oh, that's funny. So give me a couple of things that are working.
Yeah, one of the things that we launched early on, just as a way to keep people engaged. Again, realizing engagement was the marker, not attendance. We did this thing on Facebook Live every night at 7:00 Monday through Friday. We had a different one of our staff pastors get on and just do like a 5 to 7 minute, just kind of a devotional. Here's just a thought or a verse that I want to share with you, and just pray for people and whatever. And something as simple as that. And we called it Pastor Chat. And we did it 5 nights a week, from really the start of COVID up until just a couple of weeks ago. And something as simple as that, just a little 5-minute thing every day, just engaged our people in a really significant way. And what was cool about it is it didn't just engage the congregation, it engaged all my pastors on the staff in a different way in terms of speaking to the congregation. And so, some of them maybe wouldn't necessarily have the platform. They're maybe they weren't preaching pastors, or they weren't people who would normally, be on the stage on a weekend. But now they had a direct voice into the congregation, which also bonded them to the people and the people to them. And so something, as simple as that really made a difference for our people to engage them and to engage the team, which was fun. So,
yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
This might be probably if you zoom out, even before COVID, but what are some of the backdoor issues that you guys might have had that you've been able to close? Obviously engagement's one thing. Before COVID, it was a church, a family would typically attend like 1.5 times a month type of thing.
Right.
Just kind of what's going on. Are there things that you guys were doing or will do in the future to try and close the back door of people leaving, especially now that we tend to, the Big C church is growing older, struggling to grow younger?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we were actually, I think, trying to navigate some of that stuff right before COVID, and I don't know that we came up with a lot of good answers in terms of what are our back doors and how do we close them. Throughout the COVID process, what we've discovered is that people who were really embedded in relationships in the church tended to fare much better through a crisis than those who were not. And that's not a surprise, I'm sure, but it really came to the forefront for us. Those who were connected, in small groups or Bible studies or other classes, if they were engaged in some way other than just attending a Sunday service, they did far better spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and all those things. And so we just have really recognized the value in creating a greater sense of community within our church. And, like so many churches, I'm sure, we have small groups, we have some of those things, but they hadn't been a big thrust for us. They hadn't really been at the forefront. And so something that we really are pushing now that we're meeting in person again is to say, hey, Acts chapter 2 talks about this, right? The church, they attended the temple and they met in homes. And I think that we did the attending the temple thing pretty well. Maybe we didn't do the gathering in homes thing nearly as well. And so we're putting a greater emphasis on that. And we think, ultimately, I think relationships probably keep people in a church maybe more than a lot of other things, that sense of community. As preaching pastors, I'd love to say, my sermon is what keeps them coming to church. But the reality is they can get great content anywhere. So it's not content driven as much as it is, I think, a sense of community. And so I wouldn't say that we've closed that door, but I think we're aware of it now more than ever. And we're trying to build toward the future that makes a sense of community even a bigger reason to come to church and be at church. To come to hear me preach is one thing, to come be with your friends, I think, is totally different. And so that's a big emphasis for us moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that God's gifted you, and your voice and his message through you connects people, gets them to come back, but what gets them to stick is going to be that community, right? That we were born to be in community. So I think rallying around that is a great strategy.
Yeah, I think it is, but as we both know, it's easier said than done, right? Because it's not just a program; it has to be a culture, and I think that's challenging because, and I'm sure you're seeing this, all over the country. People say they crave community, and yet they don't always respond to the opportunities that you give them to get in community. And so I think kind of figuring out what does it mean to actually create community uniquely in your context is important, because there's no cookie cutter way to do this. And, there's so many great churches that have so much success, with small groups or other types of formats, but to copy and paste it, as we all know, that doesn't necessarily work. So how do you do it uniquely in your local area that works for your people? And it really is creating a culture. And so kind of the rallying cry for our team as we come into the fall is that our push is going to be to say it's going to be more normal to be in a small group than to not be in one. And that's the culture we want to create, is like, this is just what we do here. And it takes time, obviously, to build that, but we think there's a ton of value there, not only short term, but long term for the strength of the church.
Well, and I have seen success with churches when that's articulated everywhere they look.
Yeah.
On stage, from the leader to signage to websites to events, they're all driven towards getting in a community group. That's where you can be successful. But you're right, it can't just be one more program on top of 30 other programs we do. It has to be the culture of our church.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think, for better or worse, I think the church over the last number of months has been forced to really identify what are the essentials and what were just kind of nice ideas or nice programs that we had in a season of luxury, so to speak, that maybe we don't have now. And so for us, I think we're really looking at how do we simplify what we do and say, just like you're talking about, instead of this is one of 30 things that you can engage in here, maybe we only have 5 things. And that allows us to emphasize those things a lot more and say, this is what we're all about. And we're going to be all in on these things, a simpler menu to choose from, but we can do everything well.
Yeah, it seems like this has afforded you the opportunity to go time out. Okay, now when we get back in person, what are some of those things that we might have considered a sacred cow we are not going to bring with us? And what are the things we're going to do in the future that, we want to make the culture? Sounds like small groups or life groups is one of those things. Anything else that falls in that camp?
Well, we're in a unique position right now because when we actually just this early September 13th, we launched back into in-person services. And we did it in kind of a unique way by actually opening multiple sites throughout our city. And so rather than just reopening the doors, we relaunched, and we launched 3 new campuses when we did that. And so because of that, our whole model is changing to say, for us, this is the first time going multi-site. And so I know some other churches obviously have been down this road before and having to figure out what is simple enough that we can replicate it in multiple locations. And so for us right now, we're saying, hey, the Sunday gathering and small groups, that we're going to be all in on those things. And then we're going to see what develops from there. Because I don't think we're in an environment in the church in America right now to say that, hey, the 30 things we used to do, we can just go back into all of them. We either don't have the resources, or we don't have the people, or we simply don't have the opportunities. And so for us, we're just saying, man, the gathering of the church together on Sundays, and then get in homes and get in relationships throughout the week, which I know, for people who have been in church for a long time, that doesn't sound all that, exciting or glamorous, because it's very simple. But I wonder if that's actually where maybe the church has lost some of its way, is by just trying to do so many things and be so many things. We're kind of enjoying the simplicity of all of that right now. And it's easier, I think, for people to just say, yeah, I go to church on Sunday and I gather with my friends during the week. And there's a beauty in that simplicity, I think.
That's right. I love that you're doing that. That's really cool. So what a great model for other churches. So it sounds like you're not having to spend millions of dollars on each location. It's more individual location. I mean, there's things you have to have, but
yeah.
What'd you learn through all that process?
Yeah, we would have loved to have millions of dollars to spend. But so here's what's crazy, and everybody's in a different context. We're in Colorado, which is one of the more locked down places, where our regulations are similar to California. California gets the headlines, but Colorado's in a very similar spot. Yeah. And so we realized, midsummer, coming into early summer, we kept having this anticipation things were going to open back up. And by midsummer, we realized this is going to be a much slower path than what we originally anticipated. And so I was out of town for a couple of weeks on vacation, and I came back in mid-July. And I just had this idea that I really think was from the Lord about instead of opening again as one church and one group in one location, what if we found other locations throughout our city and just said, hey, depending on where you're driving from, just drive this direction instead of that direction, and we can still meet as a church. And initially just became an idea to say, how do we how do we get our church back together when we can't have these huge crowds? And so, we did it on, everybody's asked, what's the budget? Like, well, we don't have a budget. We're just trying to figure it out as we go. So we have found, hotels and event centers that are really hurting for business because they haven't been able to have events. And so they love having us in there because, their parking lot is full of cars and they actually look open to the community. And so they need the revenue to come in. And so they're making us great deals. We're getting into these places, really easily and really cheap. And so that's what we've done. We've just gone into those places. 3 locations for us, one north, one south, one east. They're all about 30 minutes away from our current location, which in Denver is not a huge drive time. People are used to that level of commute. And so that's worked well for us. You don't have to have a ton of money to do it if you can find the venues that are relatively inexpensive. Of course, we've had to invest a little bit in equipment and what have you. We're not actually live streaming. We're pre-recording sermon content. So all they have to do is have a laptop to play a video, live worship teams. And so we've just parted our volunteers out to those different teams or those different locations and had each one of our staff pastors get an extra job responsibility. So they're also campus pastors. So they're taking on extra leadership role during this time, which is great to see them grow. And really what we're finding is that you can do this much simpler and much with a lot lower investment than maybe what the traditional model has been. And I'm not going to say that it's been easy or without its challenges, but it's really opened our eyes as to what is possible. We anticipated at some point we would go multi-site in the future. And in the back of my mind, I'm looking at all these models of churches that have done it and thinking, okay, we need to, at some point it'll take us probably 9 to 12 months and we'll do all this research and we'll raise a couple $100,000 and we'll do all this. And in reality, we just launched 3 new campuses with about a 6-week lead time and probably, $20,000 all in to make it happen. So it is possible. How we sustain that long term is anybody's guess. But like we just alluded to, nobody knows what January looks like, right? So we'll figure it out as we go.
Yeah, no kidding. So it's almost it's not a church plant. It's almost a reset for you to figure out we're going to do things differently, which I think is brilliant. What would you say to what advice would you give to somebody that's thinking about starting a new church or, they're wanting to plant a church? I mean, what could they learn?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it does sort of depend on how you're looking at it right now. You could say this is the best time or worst time to plant a church. I happen to think it's always a good time to see the kingdom move forward. And so I don't think there's bad days or bad seasons to launch out because I think God responds to our faith in that. I think from a practical perspective, one of the things I probably would encourage church planters or people really starting out to think about is that it is less about the building today than it's ever been. And I think we know that, but this also provides us a unique way to think about that. If I were starting a church today, I would not want I wouldn't really be thinking about, a long-term or expensive overhead, in terms of building. I really would be thinking about locations that I can get in and out of without a lot of resources being invested. That's not to say be fly by night, because I think your community wants to see some sense of permanence that you're invested there. But I wouldn't be, my goal wouldn't be to build a multi-million-dollar building. My goal would be how can we begin to gather people and not invest our resources in that, invest our resources in developing those smaller communities, which I do think is going to be part of the wave of the future for the church. The mega church is not going to go away, I don't think. But I think we're going to see healthy expressions that are smaller, even within those mega churches, smaller congregations, more small groups, more maybe mid-sized gatherings that are going to happen. And so if I were starting out, I wouldn't get fixated on, man, I just want to be Life Church or Church of the Highlands or Saddleback or, whatever your model is. Right. I wouldn't be obsessed with that. I would really focus on how do we gather people in this community and make a spiritual investment there, because I think people are spiritually hungry in this season. And I think there's tremendous opportunity. So I'd say, don't invest your resources in overhead, invest it in discipling people.
Yeah, well said. And I'd probably add on to that my own take of, being focused on reaching people where they are. ethically diverse, right? And try to build that kind of a community that looks a lot like heaven,
Yeah.
looks like. And I think a church a church planner, a pastor that takes that mindset is going to find success.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to really understand. I think there's an interesting challenge in church planting, and I'm convinced church planting in America in the days ahead is going to look more like what a missionary might do, going to an unreached people group somewhere in the 1040 window or whatever.
Yep.
I think there has been a tendency to say, I'm going to come into this city and I'm going to bring my culture to this place. And to the degree that that is a kingdom culture, that's a healthy thing. To the degree that it's a demographic culture or a geographic culture, that can actually be a negative thing. And so can we get in these communities wherever we're called to be and say, this is the culture of the community God's called me to, and I'm going to embrace that and bring heaven to that place, as it were, but not assume that I'm going to change the cultural nuances of that place. And so when you speak about, ethnically diverse or generationally diverse or whatever, I think it's really now more than ever, it's important to be sensitive to that. Not only because I think it's effective, but because I think the tenure of our society is directed that way right now. Everybody's very dialed into that. And so I think that's an important thing for church leaders to be paying attention to.
Yeah. So where do you go for influence? Like what are things you're reading, or who do you follow?
Yeah. So I'm kind of I'm a leadership junkie. And so I will tend to follow some of the big leadership voices. John Maxwell is a go-to for me, and I've been reading his stuff since I was a teenager. And so I still listen to his podcast and read his books and just love the heart that he represents and all of that. Craig Groeschel has been a big influence on me from a distance. I've never met him, but listen to him all the time and really glean a lot from him. So those are big names, that everybody in your audience would know. Another one for me that maybe is a little bit more obscure that people wouldn't know is Dr. Mark Rutland. He leads the National Institute of Christian Leadership, which is a program I went through a number of years ago. And he was the president of Oral Roberts University and Southeastern University. And so I listened to his podcast and his book. He wrote a book a number of years ago called Relaunch. And probably top 5 leadership books that I've ever read. And I've probably read it half a dozen times now. I read it again this spring and had my team read it, and it really prepared us, I think, for how to relaunch our church this fall. And so he's been a big influence, and that book has been a big influence for us. And I'm always reading stuff. I've always got 3 or 4 books going at any given time. So I listen to podcasts when I run because it's a great way to kill time and kind of kill 2 birds with one stone, and then try to read some as well.
Good. Right on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, kind of lastly, as we wind down here, you think about reaching younger people. Seems to be a bigger kind of the big C church type of a thing that's going on. I think you mentioned this earlier, and I think you're spot on, where being able to connect people with community, because I think that's what people crave. Doesn't matter what age, what color. If you're a human being, you crave community.
Yeah.
You're built and wired to be in community.
Sure.
Is that something that you think as you try to reach millennials and engage them who are walking away from the church or not even engaging in church to begin with? Is that some of the answer, or what's some of your thoughts on that? How do you grow younger?
Yeah, I think that has to be some of the answer. And maybe, probably everybody has a little bit different take on this. I do think millennials want community, but I think it's overstated that they want it, more so than other generations. And you just mentioned it. I think we all have that need. We all have that desire. And so I think, it's less in my mind about like, hey, how do we reach this generation? It's how do we effectively reach human beings? Because we do share some of the same things, irrespective of our ethnic background or our generation. And then certainly I think this idea of saying, how do we grow younger is important. I'm convinced, and we'll find out if I'm right. But in my mind, in my heart, I really think I think the church can get it wrong if we try to sort of soft pedal what we do and what we believe in an effort to make everybody feel good and feel comfortable. I actually think the younger generation is far more able to handle opposing viewpoints and challenging concepts more than we give them credit for. And so what I've done is just dial into saying, I'm going to preach truth, and I'm going to preach it with passion, knowing that not everybody who is there is going to agree with everything. But I believe that if I can present it with an authentic sense of passion and appeal not just to the mind, but to the heart, that there's something attractive about that. And we know from the scriptures that the gospel is both attractive and offensive, depending on kind of where you're sitting and what you're hearing, and how a different topic hits, different people on different days. But I think to try to soften that in an attempt to make everybody feel good can sometimes be a dangerous road to go down. And so we just said, look, we're going to stay steady. We're going to preach what we know to be true with a heart of love, with an atmosphere of saying we embrace people and we love people, and we genuinely show passion. And I think that works for all generations, but I particularly think younger people are drawn to that. I think they want to see something that's real, that's authentic. And if you can model that in your church and in your ministry, I think that's important. So that's sort of on the spiritual side. I think on the practical side, what I think is, as much as they want community, I think they want a chance to make an impact and make a difference. And so what we're trying to do more now than ever is create opportunities for leadership and impact for people in the younger generation. So we would, at the risk of sounding, sort of age discriminatory or whatever, we'd say, all things being equal, I want to promote younger people into roles and positions of leadership, whether it's on my staff or in my volunteer team or whatever, because I think that's what helps create a culture. When people walk in the door, they want to see people who look like them. And so if you are promoting and highlighting, if you're platforming, so to speak, that generation, then I think that makes it more attractive to them. And so we really are a very diverse church, multi-ethnic, multi-generational. But here's something I think that's interesting in that is, the baby boomers love to see younger people, engaged and involved and leading the way. But millennials don't necessarily want to see, everybody at the door or everybody on the stage be a boomer. And so I think it actually is an unequal opportunity there to say, if you platform young people, you'll draw older people too. If you platform just older people, you may struggle to reach some younger people. And so that's, at least in our community, that's what we found. And I don't think anybody has the answer to it, but we think that's working at least a little bit.
I would agree with that. As I talk to churches and I'll look at who's on stage, or I'll look at the events they run.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I kind of laugh going, well, no wonder you're not growing younger. Yeah. Average age of the person on stage is like 60. It's
right.
not going to be attractional to younger people. And you have no events geared towards young families.
Yeah.
It's not going to work. It's sort of like, huh. Yeah. So I think people after, but you have to kind of go through it to realize we need to do something about this.
Yeah.
From the elder board getting younger, it's all the way down, right? It has to go throughout the whole culture of the church. And if
Absolutely.
So many churches are dying because they're not understanding that.
Yeah. And I really do think there is a burden of leadership on, pastors and people who are in senior leadership roles in the church, to not only engage and recruit and platform younger people, but to also coach and disciple the older generation as to what their role in the church needs to be in this season, because they can tend to want to hold on longer. And some of that's just a product of society now, right? I mean, we have people who are actively in the workforce in their mid to late 70s, and maybe that wouldn't have been the case 25 years ago. And so they're engaged in life in general they're more highly engaged at an older age than they would have been before. And so my job as a pastor is to also coach them to say, hey, you're, at your stage of life, you need to be investing in your, kids and grandkids, figuratively speaking. It's not so much about you anymore. It's about you giving away what you have into the next generation, and helping them see that they still have value. They're not being sidelined. But their value is not so much maybe being front and center. Their value is mentoring. Their value is encouraging. Their value is modeling things for the next generation. And if you can help them see that, that means they still have a place. They have an important role to play. And I think that's healthy for the church overall.
It's a healthy legacy they're leaving. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your insight. I appreciate you carving out some time. We learned some things from you today, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be with you, Jason. And again, just appreciate all that you guys do. And thanks for how you help us reach our community and get the word out there. So appreciate you.
Yep. Thank you. Such good insight into leading during a tough situation. Thanks so much, Matt. As I think about Victory Church and how they have led through this season, I can't help but stop and thank God for giving us wisdom and discernment to lead others when it seems like the world is crashing in. This is a tough ministry season and for everyone, but God is still good, and God's church will not only stand, it's going to thrive. So I encourage you to think differently and about how you can reach people outside your church. Now, digital tools are a very key element in all this. Now, here at Missional Marketing, our focus is to help equip you with the tools you need to reach more people. Explore our website and take advantage of the free tools that we offer. And when you're ready, we can talk about how you are pivoting during this ministry season as well. Until next time.